Dr. Evelyn Carter never believed in the supernatural, until the night she died. Clinically gone for several minutes, she expected nothing but oblivion. Instead, she found herself pulled into a war she never knew existed, a battle raging inside hospitals, where demons prey on the weak and dying, and angels fight to protect souls. Now, back from the brink, she carries a warning: death is not the end. And what's waiting in the darkness is more terrifying than you can imagine. Here is her personal testimony.
I never believed in demons, until the night I died and saw them with my own eyes. For years, I dismissed such ideas as superstition, the ramblings of the religiously obsessed or the mentally ill. As a doctor, I placed my faith in science, medicine, and logic. What I couldn't measure, I didn't believe. But death changed that. I was dead for 6 minutes. And in those 6 minutes, I saw what truly lurks in the shadows of hospitals, something far more terrifying than illness or death itself. Something ancient, malevolent, and hungry. I never imagined that hospitals, the very places we entrust with life, healing, and recovery, could also be battlegrounds for the soul. That every moment spent in one, every breath drawn between life and death, could be watched, manipulated, or even stolen. I had ignored the signs for years, the strange whispers, the patients who died with silent terror frozen in their eyes, the cold weight in the air during some deaths. I brushed off the unexplained as stress, exhaustion, or coincidence. But the truth? Hospitals are hunting grounds. Demons are real. And they aren't lurking in graveyards or haunted houses like the movies tell us. They are here, in the very places we trust with our lives. Watching, waiting, and they almost took me, too. The night I died, I thought my fight was over. My body lay lifeless on a hospital bed, my heart silent, my brain deprived of oxygen. I was supposed to slip into nothingness, or, as some believe, into the light. But before the light came the darkness. I saw them. Shadowed figures moving through the hospital, weaving between the living and the dying. Some hovered over patients' beds, whispering things I couldn't understand. Others lingered in corners, watching, waiting for something. And then I realized they were waiting for death. They weren't just observers. They were collectors. I had spent my life thinking I was fighting against disease and mortality. But that night, I learned the truth. There is something far worse than death. Losing your soul. And now, I can't stay silent. This isn't just my story, it's a warning. A warning for those who have loved ones lying in hospital beds, those who sit by their side unaware of what's truly happening in those final moments. A warning that what I witnessed is still happening right now in hospitals across the world. I was dead for 6 minutes, but what I saw will haunt me for a lifetime. And if you stay with me until the end, it will change the way you see hospitals forever. Because the battle for your soul doesn't start after death. It begins long before that. I was never the type to believe in the supernatural. Ghosts, demons, spirits, fairy tales for the ignorant. That's what I told myself. I had spent my entire life devoted to facts, evidence, and the unshakable certainty of science. From the moment I set foot in medical school, I knew I had found my purpose. Medicine was my religion, the operating room my sanctuary, and the scalpel my instrument of salvation. I didn't believe in miracles. I believed in skill, knowledge, and the precise dance of modern medicine. For years, I thrived in this world of logic and reason. I spent sleepless nights studying the complexities of the human body, memorizing diagnoses, perfecting my surgical techniques. I lived for the adrenaline rush of saving a life, of pulling someone back from the edge of death with nothing but medical expertise and the right combination of drugs. That was enough for me. Or so I thought. But looking back now, I realize the signs were always there. Small things, unexplainable things that I ignored because they didn't fit within my understanding of the world. I remember the first time it happened. I was a third-year resident, working a grueling night shift in the ICU. An elderly woman had been admitted for severe pneumonia. She wasn't critical, not yet. Her vitals were stable, her oxygen levels improving. I had just checked on her moments before. Then, without warning, the alarms blared. By the time I rushed to her bedside, she was gone. Cardiac arrest. It made no sense. No warning signs, no medical reason for her sudden death. It was as if something had snatched the life from her in an instant. As we declared time of death, one of the nurses, an older woman who had worked in hospitals longer than I had been alive, muttered under her breath, "It happens sometimes." Some patients, something takes them before their time. I scoffed at the idea. People don't just die for no reason. There was always an explanation. Maybe an undiagnosed heart condition, a sudden embolism, an electrical malfunction in the heart. I refused to believe otherwise. But it happened again and again. There were times when I would walk into a patient's room and feel it, a weight in the air, an unnatural stillness that made my skin crawl. I convinced myself it was exhaustion, the stress of long shifts. But then there were the whispers. More than once, I caught patients talking to someone who wasn't there. Some called out names. Others simply stared at the ceiling, their eyes following something unseen. I remember an old man in the cancer ward, moments before he died, turning his head to the empty corner of the room and whispering, "I told you I'm not ready yet." And then, a moment later, his heart flatlined. The nurses said it was common for dying patients to hallucinate, that the brain, in its final moments, could create visions, loved ones, memories, even unseen visitors. I believed that. I needed to believe that. I told myself that the mind plays tricks when the body is failing. That patients who saw shadows in the corners or spoke to figures no one else could see were simply experiencing the effects of hypoxia, fever, or neurological decline. I buried myself in science because science made sense. I ignored the stories from older nurses who spoke in hushed tones about patients who died screaming, their eyes wide with horror, clutching at something unseen. I dismissed the strange moments when the air in a room would suddenly turn ice cold before a patient coded. I told myself there were no demons, no spirits, no battle between light and darkness. Only disease and medicine, life and death. Until the night I died. Until I saw them myself. Hospitals are strange places at night. The bright, sterile corridors that feel so full of purpose during the day become something else when the world outside goes dark. The hum of machines, the rhythmic beeping of heart monitors, the occasional murmur of a nurse down the hall, it all blends into a quiet, heavy stillness. I had worked enough night shifts to know the feeling well. But this night was different. It was just past 3 a.m., the hour when the body is at its weakest, when patients often slip away. I was making my usual rounds in the ICU, checking charts, adjusting medications, ensuring the critical patients were stable. Room 407 was my last stop before I could sit for a moment and drink the cup of coffee that had been waiting for me for over an hour. The patient, Mr. Harrington, was a man in his early 60s recovering from a heart attack. He had been stable for 2 days, responding well to treatment, and I expected him to be discharged from the ICU within a day or two. There was no reason to worry. But as I approached the room, something felt off. I hesitated in the doorway. The room was unnaturally cold, much colder than the rest of the ICU. I could see the thin hospital blanket covering Mr. Harrington, his chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. The heart monitor beside him beeped in perfect rhythm, confirming what I already knew. He was fine. And yet, my stomach twisted with unease. I took a step inside, telling myself I was just overtired. But then, as I reached for his chart at the end of his bed, I saw it. A shadow. It stood in the far corner of the room, tall, unnaturally still, and watching. The moment my eyes landed on it, a wave of pure dread crashed over me. There were no features, no distinguishable shape, just a solid mass of darkness, deeper than the dim lighting should have allowed. It was wrong, its presence like a void, like something that didn't belong in this world. My breath hitched. I blinked, and it was gone. I stood there, my pulse pounding in my ears, trying to rationalize what I had just seen. A trick of the light? Exhaustion? My mind playing games with the shadows cast by the equipment? That had to be it. Forcing myself to ignore the chill that lingered in the air, I stepped closer to Mr. Harrington, checking his vitals. stable, normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I lingered for another moment, listening to the soft beeping of the heart monitor, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. Everything was fine. I turned to leave. And that's when the monitor flatlined. A loud, shrill alarm filled the room. My heart slammed against my ribs as I spun back to the bed. Mr. Harrington's body had gone completely still. He had been breathing just seconds ago. No warning signs, no struggling, just gone. I shouted for help. Within moments, nurses and another doctor rushed in, pushing past me to begin resuscitation efforts. I stood frozen, watching as they performed chest compressions, pushed epinephrine, shocked his heart, again and again. Nothing. After 20 minutes, he was pronounced dead. I walked out of that room in a daze. It made no sense. He had been fine. I had checked his vitals seconds before it happened. There was no medical reason for such a sudden and complete shutdown. Unless a cold shudder ran through me. My mind went back to that shadow, to the feeling of being watched, to the way the room had felt wrong before he died. I had ignored the unease, convinced myself I was imagining things. But what if I hadn't been? What if I had seen something I wasn't supposed to see? What if that shadow had been waiting for him? The thought chilled me to my core. I had spent my life believing in science, in the physical, in what could be measured and tested. But science couldn't explain what had just happened. I told no one. Not because I didn't want to, but because I knew what they would say. The rational part of me still tried to hold on, to convince myself there was a reasonable explanation. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something had been in that room. And it had taken him. It happened on a night like any other. I had been pushing through another grueling shift, running on little more than caffeine and sheer determination. 18 hours in, my body was screaming for rest, but I ignored it. There were patients who needed me, and I had long learned to silence the exhaustion gnawing at my bones. I told myself I could make it through the night, that I'd rest tomorrow. Tomorrow never came. It started with a headache, a sharp, stabbing pain behind my eyes as I checked a patient's chart at the nurse's station. I winced, pressing my fingers to my temples. Stress, dehydration, nothing new. Then the dizziness hit. The hallway tilted. My vision blurred. The sounds of the hospital around me, machines beeping, nurses chatting, the distant shuffle of footsteps muffled, as though I were sinking underwater. I tried to steady myself, gripping the edge of the counter. Then, everything went black. I don't remember hitting the floor. 1 second, I was standing, the next, I was somewhere else. At first, there was nothing. No pain, no light, no sound. Just emptiness. A vast, stretching void that swallowed me whole. Then I woke up, but I wasn't in my body. I was floating above it. I saw myself lying motionless on the cold hospital floor, my face pale and lifeless, my body completely still. A nurse screamed for help, her voice distant, muffled. Within seconds, doctors and staff rushed toward me, their movements frantic. I watched as my own body was flipped onto its back, a stethoscope pressed against my chest, someone shouting my name, checking for a pulse. She's not breathing. No pulse. Start compressions. I should have panicked. I should have been fighting to get back in, but I wasn't. Because I felt nothing. No pain. No fear. No attachment to the lifeless form on the ground. Just a strange, eerie calmness. Until I saw them. At first, I thought it was a trick of the dim hospital lighting. But then I saw them move. Shadows. Not cast by the fluorescent overhead lights. Not human. They lingered in the corners, just out of reach, watching. The same shapeless entities I had glimpsed before. But this time, I could see them clearly. There were 3 of them, dark figures, shifting and writhing like smoke, yet solid enough to cast presence into the world. They did not belong there. And I knew what they were waiting for. Me. They had come to claim me. I don't know how I knew, but I did. They had been watching for some time, waiting for my moment of weakness, for the moment when my soul would slip from my body, unprotected, vulnerable. They moved closer, silent and purposeful, gliding toward my lifeless form. And in that moment, the calmness shattered. I fought. I tried to move, to scream, to force myself back into my body, but I was frozen, trapped between worlds. They were pulling me away. The hospital room grew darker, colder. My colleagues continued their desperate attempts to revive me, but they had no idea what was happening right in front of them. I wasn't just dying. I was being taken. Then a voice. Not from the living, not from the shadows, but from above. A sudden, blinding light erupted into the room. It wasn't coming from the hospital lamps or the monitors. It was wholly overwhelming, alive. And the moment it appeared, the shadows recoiled. I felt it before I saw him. A presence so powerful, so unshakably real, that the moment it entered the room, every trace of darkness vanished. The figures hissed, twisting violently, before fleeing, disappearing into nothing. And then, a hand reached for me. I turned, and I saw him. Jesus. There is no way to describe his face, no words to explain the depth of his eyes, the immeasurable love and authority radiating from his very being. "It is not your time," he said, his voice both gentle and unshakably firm. "You must return. You must warn them." His words carried weight, truth that rippled through every fiber of my soul. And then I slammed back into my body. I gasped, sucking in air as if I had been drowning. My body convulsed, and I heard the doctors shouting, "She's back." The weight of reality came crashing down, pain, exhaustion, confusion, but beneath it all, I knew the truth. I had died. I had seen the darkness. I had seen Jesus. And I had been sent back. Because something was coming. Something far worse than death itself. I was floating. The moment my heart stopped, I was ripped from my body like a thread yanked from fabric. There was no transition, no warning. 1 second, I was in my failing body, and the next, I was above it, watching the chaos unfold beneath me. Doctors and nurses swarmed around me. "We're losing her. Start compressions now." A nurse had her hands pressed to my chest, pumping furiously, trying to force life back into me. Another doctor was prepping the defibrillator, the sharp metallic clank of the paddle sending a shiver through the air. But I felt nothing. No pain. No fear. Only awareness. I should have been panicking, but I wasn't. I was calm, detached, distant, like an observer in someone else's nightmare. That's when I realized I wasn't alone. At first, I only noticed shadows, lurking at the edges of the room, just beyond the reach of the fluorescent hospital lights. Then, as if my spiritual eyes were adjusting, I saw them clearly. Some of them were glowing. Figures of light, standing by certain patients' beds, their presence radiating power and peace. They weren't nurses, they weren't doctors, they were something else. Angels. Their faces were impossible to see, as if they weren't meant to be perceived by human eyes, but I could feel their presence. A sense of protection, of authority, of divine strength emanated from them. They stood like warriors, as if guarding the souls of the sick and the dying. But they weren't the only ones there. For every angel standing guard, there was something else lurking nearby. The shadows I had seen before were not tricks of the light. They were figures, dark, formless, yet disturbingly real. They moved with purpose, gliding from bed to bed, watching, waiting. Some lingered near unconscious patients, their twisted, shifting forms whispering things I couldn't hear. Their presence felt suffocating, like the air itself recoiled around them. I turned, scanning the room, and my stomach twisted when I realized that some beds had no angels beside them. Only shadows. And as I watched, one of them moved toward a dying patient. I felt an instinctive urge to stop it, to scream, to warn someone, but I had no voice. No body. I was trapped between life and death, forced to witness what most never see. The patient gasped, his chest heaving as the monitors beeped erratically. The doctors rushed to him, their voices filled with urgency. But they couldn't see the real battle happening right in front of them. One of the dark figures wrapped itself around him, sinking into his very being as the man let out a choked, final breath. The flatline tone echoed through the room. The nurses sighed, stepping back in resignation. "Time of death, 3:42 a.m. But I saw the truth. That man hadn't just died. Something had taken him. I turned my gaze back to my own lifeless body, watching as they continued their desperate efforts to bring me back. But now I understood. Hospitals weren't just places of healing and medicine. They were battlegrounds. Every room, every hallway, every intensive care unit was a war zone between light and darkness, between angels and demons, between salvation and damnation. And most people had no idea. I had spent my entire career believing in science, in medicine, in logic. But science couldn't explain what I was seeing. Medicine couldn't fight what was happening here. And then I heard a voice. A deep, hollow whisper from the darkness. She sees us. A cold shiver ran through me. The shadows turned toward me. And they began to move. I had been so fixated on watching the other patients that I hadn't realized my own soul was vulnerable. They knew I could see them now, and they were coming for me. The room grew darker. The edges of my vision started closing in, like the darkness itself was reaching out, trying to pull me deeper. I tried to fight, to resist, but I was powerless. I had spent my life not believing in any of this, and now I was completely unprotected. The shadows closed in, their presence suffocating, their whispering voices growing louder, until a light exploded through the room. It was unlike anything I had ever experienced before, a brilliant, radiant force so powerful that it drove back every trace of darkness in an instant. The demons screamed, recoiling like insects exposed to fire, vanishing into the void as the light filled every corner of the ICU. And then I felt a presence. It was warm, overwhelming, and infinitely stronger than any evil I had just witnessed. A hand reached for me, and I heard a voice, one that vibrated through my very soul. It is not your time. Come back. And then I slammed back into my body. My chest heaved. Air rushed into my lungs, and my entire body jerked violently as my heart started beating again. The doctors gasped in shock. She's back. I blinked, the world around me spinning as the familiar faces of my colleagues came into focus. But I wasn't the same person who had collapsed minutes before, because I had seen the truth. And now I knew the battle wasn't just for my life. It was for my soul. I wasn't fully back in my body yet. Even though I had felt the rush of air in my lungs, the pounding of my heart returning to life, something was still holding me between two worlds. I wasn't just seeing the ICU anymore. I was being pulled through the hospital, my spirit dragged down corridors I had walked 1,000 times. But this time, I saw them as they truly were. Hospitals are supposed to be places of healing, but they were infested with them. They were everywhere. Some clung to the walls, watching. Others stood by the beds of the unconscious, whispering things I couldn't hear, but I could see the effect of their words. Patients in deep comas twitched and shuddered as though trapped in nightmares. And then there were the feeding ones. These demons didn't just watch, they fed. I saw a woman in the cancer ward, tears rolling down her cheeks as she gripped the rails of her hospital bed. A dark figure loomed behind her, its jagged fingers sunk deep into her shoulders, draining something invisible from her. Her sobs grew quieter. Her expression emptied, her spirit dimming like a candle flickering in a storm. It was feeding on her despair. I wanted to scream at her, to shake her and tell her to fight, but I had no voice, no physical form. And she had no idea. This wasn't depression. This wasn't a natural response to illness. This was something else. Something dark. And it was happening to more patients than I could count. I turned a corner and found myself standing in the palliative care ward. A place where people were sent when medicine had failed them. Where death was a certainty, only a matter of when. It was darker here. Not because of the lighting, but because they were thick in the air, slithering between the beds like smoke. These weren't like the feeding demons. These were the whisperers. I saw them hunched over patients, pressing close to their ears, whispering softly. Their words were poison, and I could see it infecting those who heard them. You are alone. There is nothing after this. No one is coming for you. A frail old man gripped his sheets tightly, his mouth moving as though trying to respond, to fight back, but his eyes were empty. He had lost the battle before it had even begun. And when his chest finally rose for the last time, then fell into stillness, they took him. Not his body, his soul. I watched, horrified, as the whispering figures wrapped around him, pulling something pale and barely visible from his chest. His mouth opened in a silent scream, and then he was gone. No light, no peace, just darkness. I staggered backward, still trapped in my ghost-like form, unable to intervene. That's when I saw him. Another patient. Another life on the edge. But this man was different. He was angry. He cursed at the nurses, refused his medication, threw trays of food against the wall. He was dying and he knew it. And he hated the world for it. I saw 3 figures near him, crouched beside his bed, whispering, laughing, feeding. There is no God. You were right to hate him. Your life was meaningless. You are nothing. And the man, he was believing it. Even as the nurses tried to comfort him, even as his family sat beside him, he only grew colder, harder, angrier. I realized with horror what they were doing. They weren't feeding on despair. They weren't just whispering lies. They were claiming him. He was making the choice. Not with words. Not with prayers. With his heart. With his bitterness. With his refusal to accept anything beyond his suffering. And when his last breath came, and the machines let out that long, droning beep, they grabbed him. I watched in frozen terror as the figures latched onto him, wrapping his soul in their clawed hands. And he didn't fight. There was no angel standing at his side. No light to meet him. Because he had never wanted it. The realization hit me like a hammer. Some deaths weren't just medical. Some deaths weren't just physical. Some deaths were spiritual losses. And I had never seen it before. How many had I lost without knowing? How many had slipped away, not to a peaceful afterlife, but to this? How many had died alone, unaware that the battle for their soul was being fought in those last moments? I turned away, unable to watch anymore. But then I saw something else. Something brighter. A few rooms away, a woman lay dying. She was frail, her breathing shallow. But unlike the man before, she was not alone. A golden light surrounded her, a soft, pulsing glow. And there, at her bedside, stood a figure of radiant light. An angel. The demons nearby did not approach. They couldn't. And as the woman let out her final breath, I saw her soul rise, peaceful, glowing, free. And the angel took her hand. And they left together. I had spent my entire career trying to fight death with medicine. But death wasn't the real enemy. The real battle was what happened after. And the greatest danger wasn't dying too soon. It was dying unprepared. I had never believed in any of this. But belief didn't matter. It was real. It was happening. And most people had no idea. I was drowning in darkness. The demons were everywhere, writhing, whispering, reaching. I had no body, no voice, nothing to fight with. I was helpless, trapped between life and death, forced to witness the truth I had spent my entire life denying. I had thought science held all the answers. I had thought medicine could conquer death. But this? This was beyond medicine. This was war. And I was losing. The darkness pressed closer, pulling at me, wrapping around my form like a suffocating fog. The whispers grew louder. You are ours. No one is coming for you. You never believed. Why would he come now? A wave of despair crashed over me, thick and heavy. Maybe they were right. Maybe it was too late. Maybe I had spent too long ignoring the truth, rejecting the idea of anything beyond the physical world. Maybe this was what I deserved. Then, a burst of light. Brighter than anything I had ever seen, blinding yet warm, fierce yet peaceful. The darkness recoiled. The whispering stopped. And then, a voice. You were not meant to die yet. The voice was powerful, carrying the weight of eternity, yet filled with a gentleness that melted every fear in an instant. I turned, and I saw him. I had never believed in him. I had heard his name, of course. Dismissed him as a story, a myth, a crutch for the weak. But standing before me, more real than anything I had ever known, was Jesus Christ. His presence was unlike anything I had ever encountered, pure, overwhelming, radiating both unshakable authority and infinite love. The demons that had been swarming me? They shrank back, their twisted forms trembling, writhing in agony. The mere sight of him was enough to render them powerless. They fled, vanishing like shadows dissolving under the noonday sun. And in their absence, the crushing weight of despair lifted. The suffocating cold evaporated, replaced by a warmth that sank deep into my soul. For the first time since I had left my body, I could breathe. I fell to my knees, not because I was forced to, but because I couldn't stand in the presence of such holiness. I had spent my life thinking I was in control. That life and death were in my hands. But standing before the one who truly held all power, I realized how small, how fragile, how blind I had been. You must see the truth. Jesus stepped forward, his gaze piercing yet filled with love. You have seen the battle, but there is more. You must see the truth. And suddenly, I wasn't in the hospital anymore. The walls, the machines, the people, all of it melted away. And I saw what had been hidden from me my entire life. I saw the earth stretched before me, not as I had known it, but as it truly was. I saw hospitals, their rooms connected like glowing grids, each one a battleground for the soul. I saw angels standing guard over some beds, their presence keeping the darkness at bay. But others? Others were unguarded. The demons I had witnessed before? They were not isolated cases. They were everywhere. I saw them lurking in operating rooms, standing beside doctors who were unaware of their presence, whispering lies into the ears of the sick, stealing the souls of the dying. And worst of all, no one was fighting back. The world, even those who called themselves believers, had forgotten that this war was real. They had stopped praying, stopped standing in the gap for the weak and the dying, and the enemy was taking them. I turned to Jesus, my voice shaking. Why are they winning? His eyes, deep with sorrow, met mine. Because the world has chosen to be blind. I watched as a young woman lay dying in a hospital bed. A demon stood over her, its claws digging into her shoulders. She had no strength left to fight. Her mother sat beside her, tears streaming down her face. But then she prayed. Just a whisper. A desperate, broken cry. Jesus, help her. And in that instant, light exploded through the room. A single angel appeared, driving the demon away in an instant. The girl's body stabilized. Her breathing evened. She lived. Because of a single prayer. I turned back to Jesus, tears in my eyes. It's real. It has always been real. You must return. Jesus placed a hand on my shoulder, and the warmth of it sank into my soul like fire and light. You must go back. Tell them. Warn them. My heart clenched. They won't believe me. Some will. And that is enough. His voice carried finality. A command. A mission. And then I fell. I gasped, choking on air, my body convulsing as I was yanked back into the physical world. The doctors screamed in shock. She's back. I blinked, my vision hazy, my chest heaving with effort. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I had died. I had seen Jesus. And I had been sent back. Because the world needed to hear the truth. Revealing the truth, the spiritual war in hospitals, 700 words. I was still gasping for air, my body shuddering from the force of being pulled back into the physical world. My heart thundered in my chest, my lungs burning as if I had been underwater for hours. But even as I blinked at the doctors surrounding me, their faces a mix of relief and shock, my mind was still somewhere else. I had seen too much. And now I knew the truth. Before Jesus had sent me back, he showed me what had always been there, hidden beyond human sight, the spiritual battlefield inside hospitals. It was unlike anything I had ever imagined. Every room, every bed, every patient was connected by an unseen war. In some rooms, angels stood like warriors, their presence shining, protecting the weak and the dying. They shielded souls, fighting back the darkness with authority I couldn't comprehend. But in other rooms, there were no angels. Instead, the demons lurked. Some sat at the edge of beds, whispering despair into the ears of unconscious patients. Others fed on the grief of family members, growing stronger with every tear shed in hopelessness. And then there were those that did worse, waiting, watching, claiming. I had never seen it before, but now I realized I had always felt it. The moments where a patient would suddenly deteriorate despite no medical explanation. The feeling of heavy, suffocating air right before a death. The eyes of some patients, glazed with more than just illness, frozen with silent terror. I had dismissed it all. Blamed science, statistics, and exhaustion. But now I knew. Hospitals weren't just places of healing. They were battlegrounds for the soul. I saw how the demons chose their victims. The lonely, the hopeless, the ones without faith. Those who had lived their lives believing in nothing beyond the physical world were left completely unprotected in their final moments. I watched a man in the ICU, his body frail, his breath shallow. He had no visitors, no prayers spoken over him, no faith to hold on to. The demons crept closer. They whispered lies, planting seeds of fear in his mind. There is nothing after this. You wasted your life. No one is waiting for you. It would be easier if you just let go. And he believed them. I watched as his chest rose for the last time, and in an instant, his soul was ripped away. No light. No angel. Just darkness. He hadn't just died. He had been taken. I turned to Jesus, desperate for answers. Why? Why does this happen? His eyes held immeasurable sorrow, as if he had been watching this war for eternity. Because they do not call on me. The word struck me like a hammer. I had spent years trying to save lives with medicine. But in the moments where medicine failed, where science had no answer, I had never once thought to pray. How many had slipped away, not because we couldn't save them, but because no one fought for their soul? Then Jesus showed me another scene. A woman lay dying. Her body weak, her breathing uneven. But at her bedside, her son was praying for her. His voice trembled, tears running down his face, but he kept calling on Jesus, kept asking for mercy, for grace, for her to be taken into the light. And then I saw the angels. They surrounded her, shielding her from the darkness. The demons that had gathered hissed and shrank away, unable to cross the invisible barrier. When she exhaled for the last time, her soul rose peacefully, glowing, and an angel took her hand. She was saved, not because of her strength, not because of medicine, but because someone prayed for her. Before Jesus sent me back, I asked him one last question. How do we fight this? His answer was simple, yet powerful. Pray. Stand in the gap. Speak the truth. Then, his hand touched my shoulder, and I was thrust back into my body. Now, I sit here, alive, but not the same person who died that night. I have seen what lies beyond, and I have been sent back with a warning. If you have loved ones in a hospital, pray for them. If you work in a hospital, do not ignore the battle happening around you. If you are facing death, do not go into that darkness alone, because what I saw was real, and most people aren't ready for what's waiting for them. When I came back, I thought the worst was over. I thought that the horrors I had seen, the demons whispering to the dying, the darkness swallowing souls, the unseen war in hospitals, were only visible to me when I was on the edge of death myself. I was wrong, because now that I had seen it, I couldn't unsee it. And the more I looked, the more I realized that the enemy wasn't just preying on patients. He was working through everyone around them. It started with the families. I began to notice how despair spread like a sickness among those keeping vigil beside their loved ones. Their grief, their exhaustion, their hopelessness, it was more than just human emotion. It was being fed. I saw it happen in a waiting room one night. A mother sat beside her dying child, her fingers clutched in silent prayer. She wasn't giving up, she was fighting. Then a relative came in. His voice was low, insistent, cold. You need to accept that she's gone. There's no point in praying anymore. You have to move on. The words struck like daggers. And behind him, I saw them. The demons weren't just whispering to the dying. They were whispering to us, planting seeds of hopelessness, encouraging surrender. And when that mother finally let go, her head bowing, her faith crumbling under the weight of grief, the demons moved closer to her child's bed. It was never just about the patient. It was about weakening those who were supposed to be fighting for them. I wish I could say it stopped with the families. But I saw it in the staff too. Doctors, nurses, even me. The medical field teaches you to be pragmatic, rational, logical. We don't encourage hope when the prognosis is grim. We don't talk about miracles. We speak in numbers and statistics, in probabilities and percentages. And I never realized that hopelessness was a weapon. I remembered the times I had told families, there's nothing more we can do. The times I had seen faith drain from their eyes as I confirmed their worst fears. The times I had chosen clinical detachment over compassion because it was easier than giving someone false hope. And now I wondered, had I been helping the darkness all along? Had I been doing exactly what the enemy wanted? Telling people to stop praying, telling them to let go, convincing them that faith had no place in medicine. I had spent my entire career thinking that I was fighting for life. But in reality, I had been fighting on the wrong side. The more I watched, the more I understood. Prayer changes everything. I started to pay attention to the difference between rooms filled with hopeless silence, where the air felt heavy, where the shadows lingered, and rooms where people prayed, where family members refused to let go of faith, even when the doctors told them there was nothing left to do. And in those rooms, I saw the angels, standing like warriors beside the patient's bed, keeping the darkness away. I started praying too, not just in my mind, but out loud. Sometimes I prayed with patience, even if I knew they wouldn't survive, even if I had no medical solutions left to offer. And I watched miracles happen, not always in the way we expect. Some patients lived, defying every medical explanation. Others died, but peacefully, their souls untouchable by the darkness. But in every case, the enemy lost. And I realized this is the real fight. It was never about stopping death. It was about stopping what happens after. I had been blind for so long, blind to the power of prayer, blind to the way the enemy operates, blind to the fact that this battle has always been happening right in front of us. Now I know the truth, and I can't keep it to myself, because the enemy isn't just waiting for people to die. He's working through us, through the despair in a mother's heart, through the cold, clinical words of a doctor, through the silent surrender of a nurse who's lost all hope. And the only way to fight back is to stand in faith, to pray, to never stop believing. Because when we surrender, the enemy wins. And I refuse to let him win ever again. I stood before Jesus, my soul trembling under the weight of what I had seen. The hospitals, the war, the unseen forces that had been fighting over souls while the world remained blind. I didn't want to go back. How could I? How could I return to my life knowing the truth, that death wasn't the end, that medicine wasn't the answer, that the war for every soul was happening right in front of us? I opened my mouth to speak, but Jesus already knew my thoughts. His eyes, filled with power and sorrow, met mine. You must return. I shook my head. They won't believe me. Some will. His voice carried finality. A command. A mission. You must warn them. I felt a force wrapping around me, pulling me backward. The light, the presence, the overwhelming peace, it was fading. I tried to fight it, to hold on to him. No, please. Let me stay. But it was too late. I was falling. Pain. Searing, suffocating pain. Air rushed into my lungs like fire, my body convulsing as my chest heaved violently. I heard shouts, metallic clattering, the beeping of machines exploding back into reality. Oh my God, she's breathing. She's back. Somebody get a pulse. I tried to move, but my limbs felt heavy, like I had been buried under concrete. My vision was blurry, the harsh fluorescent hospital lights stabbing into my retinas. A face loomed over me, a nurse, her eyes wide with shock. Dr. Carter, can you hear me? I tried to speak. Nothing came out. I was back, but I was not the same. The doctors and nurses stood frozen around me, their faces a mix of disbelief and terror. I had been gone for several minutes. No pulse, No breathing, no brain activity, clinically dead. And yet, here I was. One of the nurses whispered under her breath, her hands trembling as she held mine. "You were gone. We lost you." I looked around at the familiar chaos of the hospital room, the beeping monitors, the IVs in my arms, the cold air against my skin. But my heart was still somewhere else. I had seen beyond this world, and I could never unsee it. Tears stung my eyes as I realized why I had been sent back. It wasn't for me. It was for them. For every dying patient lying in a bed alone, unaware of the forces waiting to claim their soul. For every grieving family being pushed toward despair, unknowingly making their loved ones vulnerable. For every doctor and nurse who had convinced themselves that science was enough when it never would be. I had been sent back with a warning, because most people weren't ready for what was waiting on the other side. And now I had no choice. I had to tell them. I had to wake them up. I was supposed to be dead. Every medical chart said so. The monitors had flatlined. My heart had stopped. My brain had gone without oxygen for far too long. And yet, here I was. Alive. Speaking. Remembering. But I was not the same person who had died that night. I couldn't go back to my life as if nothing had happened. How could I, knowing what I knew? Seeing what I had seen? So I started talking. And that's when the trouble began. At first, I tried to tell my colleagues, other doctors, nurses, medical professionals who had worked beside me for years. I told them about the dark figures I had seen, about the battle for souls happening in the very rooms we worked in every day. I expected disbelief. What I didn't expect was the fear in some of their eyes. Some dismissed me immediately, laughing it off. "You had a near-death hallucination, Carter. It happens. Oxygen deprivation messes with the brain. You probably imagined all of it." But then, there were the others. The ones who listened and went pale. One night, as I was leaving my shift, a doctor I barely knew pulled me aside. He leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're not crazy. I've seen them too." I stared at him, heart pounding. "What did you see?" He glanced over his shoulder, as if making sure we weren't being watched. "They come when people die." His eyes flickered with something haunted, something that told me he had carried this secret for a long time. "They take the ones who aren't ready." I stopped talking about it years ago. I suggest you do the same. And then, he walked away. A few days later, they came for me. 2 men in suits, not doctors, not administrators, just men with unreadable faces who knew things they shouldn't. They met me in a private conference room, under the guise of checking on my recovery. I knew better. One of them slid a folder across the table. Inside were my medical records, the proof of my death, the scans, the reports, the signed declaration that I had been clinically gone for several minutes. The man across from me laced his fingers together, voice calm but cold. "You've been talking about your experience, Dr. Carter." I said nothing. "You need to stop." My skin went cold. People in your position, respected medical professionals, need to be careful with the stories they tell. You wouldn't want to tarnish your reputation, would you? I swallowed. I know what I saw. The second man, who had remained silent, leaned forward. His eyes were dark, unsettling. That's the problem. A beat of silence passed. Then, without another word, they stood and walked out of the room. They never identified themselves. They left no contact information, no names, nothing. But the message was clear. They don't want people to know I should have been afraid. But fear wasn't stronger than the truth. I had been sent back for a reason. And I realized this wasn't just about hospitals anymore. This was about a deception. A carefully controlled lie that had been fed to the world for so long that even those who had seen the truth were too afraid to speak. I refused to be one of them, because people deserve to know what really happens when they die. And I wouldn't stop until they did. I don't expect everyone to believe me. I was a doctor, a person of science, logic, and evidence. I once would have scoffed at a story like mine, dismissing it as a hallucination, a fever dream, the product of oxygen-starved neurons firing in random patterns. But I know what I saw, and now I know the truth. The enemy doesn't always come with fangs and fire. He doesn't need to. He works in the silence, in the slow surrender, in the moments of doubt when people stop fighting, stop believing. And that's why you have to be ready. Because whether you see it or not, the battle is happening. And most people are completely unprepared. 1. Never stop praying. Prayer is not just words. It is a shield, a weapon, a declaration of faith that pushes back the darkness. If you have a loved one in a hospital, pray over them. Even if they are unconscious. Even if they are too weak to speak. Do it anyway. Because I have seen what happens in those last moments. I have seen who comes to claim the soul when there is no faith left to hold on to. And the only thing standing between a soul and the enemy is prayer. 2. Reject hopelessness. Despair is a doorway. I saw it over and over, how demons don't always steal souls outright. Sometimes, they just convince people to give up. They whisper things that sound rational, even logical. There's no point in praying. Nothing is going to change. You need to accept that this is the end. And the moment someone believes it, they let go. They surrender. Not just to death, but to what comes after. Do not let despair take root. Fight it. Even when everything seems lost, even when medicine says there's no hope left, ***, never stop believing. Because the moment you give up, the enemy moves in. 3. Speak life, not death. I used to think that words were just words. That when a doctor told a family, there's nothing else we can do, it was just a fact, not an attack. But now I understand words have power. I watched demons feed off of every resigned sigh, every hopeless declaration, every quiet acceptance of death. I watched how even doctors, unknowingly, became tools of darkness when they stripped people of faith by telling them there was nothing left to believe in. Be careful with your words. Even in grief, even in pain, choose to speak life. Because when you declare that all hope is gone, you open a door. And something is always waiting to walk through it. The most dangerous lie the enemy has ever told is that he doesn't exist. That hospitals are just hospitals. That death is just death. That there is nothing beyond what we can see. Because if people don't believe in the war, they won't fight it. And that's how he wins. But now you know the truth. And if you've made it this far, you were meant to hear this. Because this war is real. And you still have time to fight. If you're reading this, you were meant to hear it. This is not just a story. It's not fiction, paranoia, or the ramblings of a doctor who lost her mind after dying for a few minutes. This is a warning. And it may be the most important thing you will ever hear. Because whether you believe it or not, it is happening. Right now. In hospitals, in homes, in places of suffering and despair. The battle is being fought over every soul. And the enemy is counting on you to ignore it. I never wanted to believe in demons. I spent my entire life trusting in science, medicine, logic, things I could see and measure. But in the end, it wasn't science that saved me. It was Jesus. And now I know the truth. Hospitals are more than just places of healing. They are battlegrounds where light and darkness fight for every soul. Some people make it through. Some don't. And the difference isn't always medical. I've seen how they work. The demons don't come to take souls by force. They wait. They whisper. They convince people that there is nothing beyond this life, that God isn't real, that faith is pointless, that prayer won't change anything. And the moment you believe it, they win. That's how they get you. Not through possession. Not through horror movie theatrics. Through hopelessness. Through silence. Through the moment when you stop fighting and accept the lie that this is all there is. But that's not the truth. The truth is they can't take what belongs to God. If you hold on to faith, if you stand in prayer, if you fight back, even in the weakest moments, they lose. If you have loved ones in a hospital, do not leave them unprotected. Pray over them. Even if they don't believe, pray anyway. Speak life. Reject despair. Never say, there's nothing more we can do, because there is always more to be done. Fight for their soul. Because I have seen what happens when no one does. I have seen who comes when a person dies alone. And I wouldn't wish that fate on anyone. This message isn't for everyone. Most people will ignore it. They will roll their eyes, rationalize it away, tell themselves it was just a hallucination, a glitch of a dying brain. And that's exactly what the enemy wants. But you're still here. You're still reading. Which means this warning was meant for you. Because there is still time. Time to open your eyes. Time to prepare. Time to protect those you love. The world is getting darker. And the enemy is waiting. Waiting for you to doubt. Waiting for you to stop believing. Waiting for you to surrender. Don't let them win. Because when the time comes, you will either be surrounded by angels or by something else. The choice is yours. But now, you can't say you weren't warned.